In the previous lesson, we examined the role that the Prime Minister plays within both the political structure of the government as well as within broader society. Now, in this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the powers that this Prime Minister has. Now, ultimately, we are going to focus on this idea of the Prime Minister's powers. And the first thing that we should note is that the Prime Minister has arguably, and actually this is inarguable to be honest, that they have more powers than any other cabinet ministers. The resources available to the Prime Minister are subject to very important constraints and will also vary according to different circumstances. Just like with the roles of the Prime Minister, the powers of the Prime Minister have developed out of constitutional conventions as well as historical tradition over many centuries. And so, as a result of this, we see that the powers of the Prime Minister sometimes wax and wanes as time goes on, and some powers sort of fade away, other powers are actually introduced. And so, we talk about the powers of the Prime Minister in the present day is what we're going to focus on. The main powers of the Prime Minister are the power of patronage, authority within the cabinet system, party leadership, public standing, policy making, and the role of the Prime Minister's office. Okay, some of these you will note are expressly stated as powers that derive out of the royal prerogative. Others are considered to be something of a political power, like for example authority within the cabinet system. So, essentially, the first of these powers is, like I've said, the power of patronage. This is arguably one of the most important of the powers that the Prime Minister has. And what patronage essentially means is the power of an individual to appoint someone to an important position. That's what patronage means. And the Prime Minister has this power. They have the power to essentially appoint and dismiss people from positions of high office. The most significant of these powers of patronage is the ability for prime ministers to appoint government ministers. Other patronage powers have also existed, but have been sort of curtailed as time goes on. So, for example, these are examples of powers that have been that have waxed and waned as time goes on. For example, judicial and ecclesiastical appointments, Prime Minister's role in appointing judges and senior members of the Church of England have been reduced significantly, partly by the Brown government, and also other constitutional conventions and constitutional reforms that have taken place under essentially the entire period of New Labour. So, for example, when it comes to the judiciary, as we will look to when we look at the next major topic, what happened was we see the introduction of something known as the Judicial Appointments Commission or Committee. And what the JAC essentially does is take some of the powers away from the Prime Minister in terms of their role of appointing judges. Similar things takes place in relation to appointing ecclesiastical individuals, so members of the Church of England, for example, senior members of the Church of England. All of these are powers that have been curtailed in recent years, and so as a result of which the most significant power is arguably the power of the appointment of government ministers. The Prime Minister also has a power in relation to the honours system. So the Prime Minister has the role in the honours system, but this also has been a power that has been reduced over the years. So again, the patronage system has been one that really we see the waning of prime ministerial power in this regard. So when you think, and if you were ever to get an exam question, an essay question that was talking about assessing the powers of the Prime Minister in the modern context, in the modern day, you could talk about the power of patronage being one of a reduction in power, not one of a gaining in power. When it comes to appointing cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister's power is essentially uncontested in this regard. They have the power to appoint and dismiss government ministers, specifically and particularly at the cabinet level. This provides the Prime Minister with a significant and crucial advantage over other colleagues. Whereas other cabinet ministers are equal amongst each other, the Prime Minister has the power to dismiss them, which is not a power that they have over each other. The Conservative Party gives its leader a free hand in the appointment of cabinet ministers. And in theory, prime ministers can create a cabinet of their own image. They can reward supporters, they can penalise people who are disloyal to them, and they can create something of an echo chamber whereby everybody who is in that cabinet agrees with them, and if you don't agree with them, you get kicked out. That is theoretically possible and something that can happen. One of the things that curtails this power, again, if we're thinking back to an exam question looking at the assessment of prime ministerial power, you could use the example of the 2010 coalition agreement, which essentially required the prime minister at the time, who was David Cameron, to appoint 5 Liberal Democrats to his cabinet, and one of those had to be Nick Clegg, the deputy prime minister. This is part of the agreement that essentially gets the Liberal Democrats to form the coalition with David Cameron and the Conservatives in the first place. What is quite interesting in this regard is that this is representative of something of a limitation on the Prime Minister's authority. David Cameron, as per this 2010 coalition agreement, couldn't have just said no to the appointment of 5 Liberal Democrats to his cabinet. And so as a result of which, he had a limitation in terms of who he could appoint. He couldn't just appoint 5 extra Conservatives, for example. In terms of further cabinet control that the Prime Minister has the power of cabinet reshuffles. They can reshuffle cabinet portfolios whenever they so choose. Some ministers might be moved to another post. Some ministers might just be dismissed entirely from the cabinet authority. And what this does is it allows the Prime Minister to promote successful ministers and demote those who have underachieved. So even though in the cabinet there are different roles for each individual, so there are different departments that deal with different areas of policy, it is actually seen to be the case that there are some areas that are seen to be more prestigious than others. This relates all to the quite gross traditions of power and prestige and esteem and elitism, but essentially things like Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary are considered to be the great ministries of state, the great secretaries of state, compared to, for example, Culture, Media and Sport, or Minister for Exiting the European Union. So there is something of a hierarchy there, despite the fact that these are just all supposedly equals within cabinet, and so as a result of which they just deal with different areas of policy. Cabinet ministers want to get those really, really, really important jobs. Chancellor of the Exchequer, being in number 11, is a very important job. Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, all of these things are considered to be more important jobs than some of the lesser important roles within cabinet. And so as a result of that, the Prime Minister can utilise reshuffles to promote that. They can promote the successive ministers and put them into the higher, more prestigious offices of state, and then they can demote the people who have underachieved. Ultimately, the Prime Minister has the full authority and power in the timing of a cabinet reshuffle, but of course, one limitation of this would be the fact that a reshuffle could be forced by way of a sudden resignation by a cabinet minister. We see this, for example, with the resignation of with the resignation of Sajid Javid as Chancellor of the Exchequer and then was ultimately replaced by Rishi Sunak under the Johnson administration, which is quite an interesting example there, where the Chancellor of the Exchequer actually had disagreements with the Prime Minister in terms of the direction of public policy, the direction of economic policy. In addition to the reshuffle and the ability to form cabinets and have authority within cabinets, there is also the fact that the Prime Minister has specific authority within the core executive. The Prime Minister chairs cabinet meetings, manages the agenda of cabinet meetings, directs and sums up cabinet decisions, creates cabinet committees and appoints those cabinet committees members, holds bilateral meetings, appoints senior civil servants, organises the structure of government. All of these things are powers and authorities that are had with the Prime Minister. Now, again, depending on the Prime Minister we talk about will depend on the particular way in which they conduct their cabinet system. So, like I've said in the previous lesson, under David Cameron, he opted for a system under the coalition whereby he would chair cabinet meetings with Conservative members only, and then chair the full cabinet with the Liberal Democrats involved secondly. In addition to this, Tony Blair decided to opt out for the most part in terms of cabinet meetings and decided instead to have one-on-one bilateral systems, or maybe trilateral systems, whereby he would promote this idea of quote-unquote sofa government. In terms of the setting of the agenda, the Prime Minister can set the agenda of Cabinet meetings by controlling the information which is presented by Cabinet Ministers and by determining which issues and papers should be brought before the Cabinet. So he or she can have the authority to decide who essentially is going to have the most speaking time in the Cabinet and what issues are going to have the most directed attention in the Cabinet. They can also keep potentially difficult issues off the cabinet agenda, so as to potentially stop deadlock and disagreement, but also to essentially allow for the lack of criticism to take place within the cabinet system. Deciding the chair, membership and remit of cabinet committees, essentially this is another power that the Prime Minister has, and this is also important in the sense that this is where a lot of the detailed policy discussion occurs, and a lot of the actual setting out of policy, which then should, in a good, efficient system, make its way into legislation and then ultimately pass into law. All of these things are very important powers that the Prime Minister has. In addition to all of these things, the Prime Minister also is the leadership of the largest party in the House of Commons and can command the confidence of the members of the parliamentary party. A working majority in Parliament essentially strengthens the position of the Prime Minister. It means that he or she is likely to enjoy the confidence of the Commons and also be able to enact legislation relatively smoothly. The larger the majority, as we have seen in recent years and also in the late 1990s, also significantly influences the effectiveness of legislation being passed. When we see 1997 roll around and New Labour get elected with the largest majority in history, we see so much important groundbreaking legislation. We see things like devolution, constitutional reform, House of Lords reform, human rights provisions, all of which are really significant. Similarly, when we see in 2008 and 2019 the 80-seat majority that the Johnson administration has, or had, should I say, this also significantly influences policy. It meant that they were able to vote through a deal on the Brexit, the final Brexit decision, and ultimately pass other pieces of legislation in relation to policing, and then ultimately in relation to emergency powers given in relation to the lockdown and coronavirus pandemic. Party leadership strengthens the authority of the Prime Minister. Labour and Conservative leaders were elected by their MPs and by members of the party. This in turn legitimises their position, it legitimises the decisions that they make. And when you see people like Tony Blair enjoying authority within his party in his first years in office because of the two landslide elections, it means that Blair's reforms essentially Labour's organisation so as to enhance his position as leader in more substantial ways. In addition to this, we also have the public standing that the Prime Minister has. He is or she is supposed to be considered the main spokesperson of the nation, and in any context, such as international meetings, they act on behalf of the head of state, and so they act almost as a de facto head of state. This is also something where we see the fact that the Prime Minister has unique access to the media. The Prime Minister's office holds a key position in ensuring unique access to the media. And in terms of public perception, the Prime Minister is perceived as the head of state. And in some circumstances and context, you can make the argument that this ellipses that of the monarch. And in fact, in any circumstance, you could make that argument that this ellipses that of the monarch. when we see that the dishevelled system of the monarchy as head of state compared to that of the strengthened position of the Prime Minister as head of state, you can see that the Prime Minister is clearly perceived as the head of state, de facto head of state, despite the fact that we do have still to this day a monarchy that is actually in reality the head of state of the United Kingdom.